to the link online. Now, whose fault was that, eh? See? Now, I have to explain what was going on because we like to play around a little bit before the show, and the technician Chantal Saint-Sauveur was chastising me for playing with the microphones before the show. So she said, I'm going to turn your mic off. And look what happened. You cut the first words. Welcome to the link
That's
online.
public shaming. That's not nice, Mark.
Always blame the technician, eh?
All right, let us move on to something a little bit more serious. Well, we're going to introduce, first of all, who's here, because we mentioned Chantal Saint-Sauveur, who's smiling and laughing in the control room. And deep in the dark regions, the man who holds the key to our supply cabinet, Pierre Dutil, who we think is a spy because he's always hiding in the dark. But that being said, we have with us Lynn Desjardins.
Hello.
Levon Savunt.
Hello.
And Marie-Claude Simard.
Hello.
And I'm Mark Montgomery. And on the show today, we have Lynn.
I'll tell you about a powerful reaction from women to some of U.S. President Trump's comments about allegations of sexual assault.
And Levon.
And speaking of Trump, we'll hear from Mr. Trump about why he refused to meet with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Ah, that's called a diplomatic snub. Maybe.
Or was it?
Or was it, yes. Marie-Claude?
Well, I have surprises for you guys, and I'll give you a hint.
Food?
Stuff you put in your mouth.
Yay!
All right. And with the 73rd General Assembly of the United Nations ongoing this week until early October, I'll speak to an expert about the effectiveness of this international organization. We'll also have some of your comments to various stories that are available on our website. That's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. Well, we have literally hundreds of national leaders and an even greater number of associated ministers, diplomats, officials, and assistant staff. They're all in New York City this week for the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. But while the UN conducts any number of very useful acts in the area of international health and international aid, refugees, and so on, really, its main purpose is to contain international aggression. And I'll speak with an expert on the effectiveness of the General Assembly and the UN itself. Aurel Brown. Aurel Brown is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto, and he's the associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. And in this excerpt of our longer conversation, he talks first about what the General Assembly accomplishes.
In part, countries want to get attention. They want to get international attention. But in terms of effectiveness, there are some important questions to ask about this forum because it also represents in many ways the sad state of the world. The vast majority of the countries that are represented have governments that are dictatorial and corrupt. Democracies are a minority. So this is why Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a former American UN ambassador, was so frustrated by the excesses demonstrated at the General Assembly by many of the representatives who came from these dictatorships that he called the General Assembly the theater of the absurd. That may have been very harsh, and perhaps it doesn't represent what our overall view should be, but it was also a warning of the excesses that the General Assembly has been capable of demonstrating and has on occasion.
The preceding League of Nations failed because it had no real power and was generally ignored, and yet we've had a couple of situations with the UN that seem to indicate kind of the same thing. I mean, Russia invaded Crimea, and we have China occupying the South China Sea, but nothing really happened about that.
That's a very important question because the central purpose of the UN was something called collective security, which meant that, first of all, the power of moral suasion would be employed. The rule by power would be replaced by a kind of international rule of law. That was the hope of the League of Nations, and it was the hope in creating the United Nations. I mean, yes, the UN has many other functions, economic, health, and so on, but that central role of preserving peace was so crucial, and the League failed because it was unable to do that. Well, in the 21st century, we had something very similar in 2014, as you pointed out. Russia violated international law in the most blatant way by invading Ukraine and annexing illegally Crimea. The United Nations was faced with this huge dilemma. What was it going to do in the case of a powerful state, a member of the Security Council, a permanent member of the Security Council, having engaged in this kind of violation of international law, a violation of the central founding principles of the United Nations? It proved to be impotent.
And what about the South China Sea situation?
It is also very, very risky, and it demonstrates that the United Nations is very, very limited. So the festivities, this grand theater that we see in New York, may offer some hope, but at the same time, it cannot hide those enormous problems that not only remain unresolved, but the big questions that especially what happened in 2014 opened up.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Aurel Braun, a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto and an associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. The full conversation is in the highlights section. And Levon, you mentioned something important, which I kind of left out, and I shouldn't have left out.
Well, I mean, it's not just Russia and China, it's the United States. So there is a huge problem, of course, when it comes to the permanent members of the Security Council, the 5 permanent members. So whether it's Russia invading Ukraine or United States invading Iraq, there isn't much that other countries can do about it because these countries have a veto power.
Mm-hmm. Good point indeed. So, and of course, if you have any thoughts on this, drop us a line. Just go to that story and post your comments at the bottom, and we'll take a look at them later on. Coming up, we're going to be looking at Donald Trump, and he is unhappy with Canada, and apparently, we're not quite sure, but he may have snubbed Canada's Prime Minister. Well, once again, U.S. President Donald Trump is saying that he's very unhappy with Canada and he wants the world to know it. And Levon, what is it about, what is going on this time?
Well, it's same old, same old. It's all about money. It's all about renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. It's a trilateral free trade agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. And, Donald Trump has never hidden the fact that he hates it, not just dislikes it, he hates it. And so the 3 countries had to go and start renegotiating this agreement to please Mr. Trump. And I mean, to be fair, it was, it was already 24 years old, and there were certain things that needed updating. So for a year now, or more than a year, the negotiators have been working very hard. And last month, U.S. and Mexico cut aside the deal and basically have an agreement in principle that they're going to present to the U.S. Congress on October the 1st, and we're expecting the text to be released any day now. Canada proved to be a much tougher negotiator than I think Mr. Trump was hoping. I think he was just hoping it's going to be a breeze, just walk in the park. It's not going his way, and he's not very happy about it. So on Wednesday, talking to reporters, he let it known that he apparently refused a meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to discuss this issue. Let's listen to him responding to a question from a reporter.
Did you reject a one-on-one meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau?
Yeah, I did.
Why?
Because his tariffs are too high and he doesn't seem to want to move, and I've told him forget about it. And frankly, we're thinking about just taxing cars coming in from Canada. That's the mother lode. That's the big one. We're very unhappy with the negotiations and the negotiating style of Canada. We don't like their representative very much. They've taken advantage. I love Canada, by the way. I have so many friends. I have everybody. It's so many friends. But that has nothing to do with this. I'm representing the United States. Mexico was totally, they were great. By the way, the new president has been great. The deal is done. Now it has to go through Congress, and a lot of things have to happen. But we've done. Bob Lighthizer, who's here someplace. Where's Bob? Bob Lighthizer has done a great job of negotiating, as they have. But the deal is done. It's up to Congress. But Canada has treated us very badly. They've treated our farmers in Wisconsin and New York State and a lot of other states very badly. Dairy products, 300%. 300%. How do you sell a dairy product at 300%? The answer is you don't. What it is a barrier. It's basically they're saying, we don't have any barriers. By the way, it's 300%, so you don't send it in because you can't compete. So Canada has a long way to go. I must be honest with you. We're not getting along at all with their negotiators. We think their negotiators have taken advantage of our country for a long time. We had people that didn't know what they were doing, and that's why we had, over the last 5 or 6 years, if you average it out, we had $800 billion a year in trade losses. It's ridiculous. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Whose math is that?
Well, you see,
that's the question.
That's the question. One has to fact check what Mr. Trump says because he has admitted in the past of using made-up statistics just to make a point. By the way, the Prime Minister's office has sent out a very curt statement saying that they've never asked for a meeting. So, but they're not. It's absolute silence on all the other things. Here, I think you have to understand that yes, Canada wants to protect the dairy industry, so that 300% tariffs on milk products, dairy products that Canada imposes. It's not 300, it's about 270%, but it's still pretty high.
However, the Americans do subsidize their own. They have farm subsidies that are not tariffs.
Absolutely, absolutely.
They subsidize.
And Canada wants to protect what's called the Chapter 19 of NAFTA. This is the one of the dispute resolution mechanisms. But Canada also wants assurances from Trump that he's not going to impose those tariffs on the auto industry, the one that he called the mother law. That would be an absolute disaster for Canada's manufacturing sector, for Canada's auto industry, which is based in Ontario, a very, very important province for any federal government hoping to stay in power. So, and that's why...
Parenthetically, it would also be bad for the American auto industry.
Yes, because they're so integrated. They have been integrated not just over the last 24 years of NAFTA, but for decades before that. So that's why Trudeau is kind of holding off, and he's refusing to abide by this deadline of October 1st. And listen to what Trudeau was saying at a press conference, again in New York, again on Wednesday.
Good morning, Prime Minister. With respect to NAFTA, you and the Foreign Minister have repeatedly said that you will not negotiate in public. But yesterday it seemed as though Ambassador Lighthizer was doing just that by suggesting in some comments that Canada has not given up enough in NAFTA, is not willing to budge enough, that the American deadlines are in fact firm. Do you find those comments harmful to the process, and are you worried that perhaps the Americans have a different outlook on where talks are at than you and Minister Freeland do?
We continue to engage in near continuous negotiations. The conversations are constant and ongoing. We are very much looking in a positive, constructive way to getting to a renewed NAFTA that will be a trilateral agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. As I've said many times, I will not negotiate in public. We will continue to stay focused on getting a good deal for Canadians, recognizing that it is very possible to get to a deal that is both good for Canadians, good for Americans, and good for the entire continent. We will stay focused on that. We will keep working as long as it takes to get to the right deal for Canada.
Is it possible to get to that point even if the U.S. moves on with just Mexico in the short term?
We will keep working on a broad range of alternatives. A broad range of paths are ahead of us. We're going to keep focusing on trying to get to the right deal for Canadians as we move forward on negotiations.
And that was Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, answering questions at a press conference in New York on Wednesday.
Cool under fire.
Yes, cool under fire. And I guess they're hoping to wait out the Trump administration and see what happens at the midterm elections in November.
I remember reading an analyst who was saying that Canada is also stalling because they want the Quebec elections to proceed before they have to make any concessions on dairy, because Quebec is a major segment of Canada's dairy market. I think they have 50% of all of Canada's dairy quotas.
And the Quebec election is October 1st.
Yeah, so they're sort of not budging on this. And the theory was by this, I can't remember who it was, but they want to wait until the elections are over before they make a concession. And what they might do is, in fact, concede some to the Americans, concede access to the Canadian market, but pay off the Quebec dairy producers with tax dollars, obviously, to sort of calm their reaction, because that's exactly what happened with the CETA negotiations.
Absolutely. Because
the dairy farmers, again, were suffering from CETA, and the Canadian government said, well, we'll put aside $300 million to subsidize them, or not subsidize them, but help them over the period when they have to adjust their own quotas and production and so on.
And, of course, the federal government is also very interested in keeping Quebec happy, because they're facing an election next year, and the way the plan, the vote spreads out, most parties, in order to get into power, do need to get quite a few seats in the province of Quebec, a majority of seats in the province of Quebec.
Indeed, in Quebec and Ontario, I think there's something like, I'm just more or less guessing here, but 73 seats in Quebec.
Yes, and that's why the dairy industry has so much power.
Yeah. All right, we have some of your comments to letters coming up in just a moment. All right, and some of the comments that came into various stories this week, and we're going to start off with a comment to our story about space policy to focus on sovereignty and security. Now, this was a story about Canada's space policy, but it mentioned space projects by the European Union, Russia, and the United States as well. And we had a comment from a website address in the UK that asked,
I'm curious to know where both parties stand on our current space policy, vision for space, and the Constellation program.
Now, I'm not sure what both parties were referred to in the story, because it mentions, as I said, several countries. It was a comment from the UK, so was it referring to Canadian political parties or British political parties or the US system of two political parties? I also looked up the Constellation program, which was a NASA program to return to the moon and then to Mars, but that was canceled by President Obama. However, the U.S. is proceeding with space development, perhaps just not on the same time frame as the original Constellation program. A little bit confusing on that comment, but nonetheless, if you have a comment, once again, post it to the story and perhaps make it a little clearer for us at this end. On another science-type story, the world's first of blasting heart blockages, Norm Williams wrote about his story, offering to volunteer for this procedure.
Yeah, if it works to clean out heart artery stents, do you need someone to try that out on? I have 5 stents in my LAD, all butted up against each other due to an out-of-control spiral dissection that kept splitting and splitting until it had the end of the artery. I also have 3 stents in my right descending artery. Let me know. Wow.
Wow. All right, longtime RCI fan Peter Ashcroft commented on a story called Anthropocene, Art Exhibit on Human Influence on Earth.
And he asks, how did the world evolve prior to the time and influence of Homo sapiens?
Well, we know it evolved in one case because of a giant asteroid that hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. All right, on a story about climate change in Canada's wine industry, Sean wrote,
why is it, in the first 2 minutes of the interview, that Professor Pickering alludes to a positive effect of climate change, that we can grow grapes more north than Niagara? There is no positive thing about climate change on a sustainable long-term scale.
And he wrote that in capital letters too. There is no positive. We had an interesting response to a story about a shortage of school teachers in Canada, and this came from Kylie Fisher.
I find this very frustrating. My husband and I moved over here because of the teacher shortage. We did our research on the regulation process and found that British Columbia would register me. I'm fully qualified and have been teaching in both New Zealand and Australia. It took 6 months to tell me that I wouldn't be getting registration and that I would need to study 5 level 100 papers unrelated to teaching to get fully registered here. So yes, they have a shortage, but they also are turning down fully trained and experienced teachers.
Anybody have an idea what level 100 papers are?
Level 100, wouldn't that be the first year of university?
Could be.
Because then you have 200 level and 300 level. I don't know.
Yeah,
I would guess.
Maybe it's an Australian term or something. You should look that up while we're nasty chatting around here, because you're the social.
Put her on the spot, why don't you? Yeah.
All right. Finally, we have a story about rude Canadian border agents, and Russ Stroh wrote.
Having lived next to Canada and visited many times, my latest visit supports the experience of others that the Border Patrol agents are rude and unfriendly to visitors.
All right, there you go.
All right, then. Good impression. Wow.
Have you been through the border at all lately?
Yeah. You know what? Knock wood. My interactions with border agents, be that American or Canadian, have generally been pretty friendly and positive.
He's great at fooling people.
That's the Russian accent.
Right. Okay, we have a story coming up about this huge kerfuffle in the United States regarding the nomination possibly to the Supreme Court of the U.S. with a man named Brett Kavanaugh. That's coming up.
Well, I thought to myself, here we go again.
Well, let's proceed with this anyway. Then
I was supposed to get a chance to cough. Sorry, it's flu season in Montreal. Everyone's sick.
Okay, as we know, this is in the news, certainly in the U.S., dominating the news in the U.S. and also here in Canada. And this is about the allegation of a sexual assault made by this nominee to the Supreme Court of the U.S. There was extensive reaction in Canada to a tweet. Lynn, you've been looking into this.
Yeah, you may have to read this. We're talking about Christine Blasey Ford and her charge that the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, assaulted her in high school. Now, she said that Kavanaugh and a friend pushed her into a bedroom during a house party, and that Kavanaugh, who would have been about 17 at the time, climbed on top of her, groped her, tried to take her clothes off, and covered her mouth when she started to scream. The allegation first came to light on September 21st, and in a tweet, U.S. President Donald Trump. Actually, that's not true. But Trump commented first on September 21st that if Blasey Ford's account was, quote, as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities, unquote. Now, this provoked just a storm of activity online on both sides of the border and in many other countries. And there was a creation of a hashtag, why I didn't report, and that was on social media, referring to why people, women did not, and probably men as well, didn't report these sexual assaults in general. So for more on this reaction in Canada, I contacted Drini Greer. She is the Director of Human Rights and Equity at Lakehead University, that's in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and I asked her about her initial reaction to Trump's tweet.
Well, I thought to myself, here we go again. We have another typical mainstream response to sexual violence against women. You know, one that reduces the impact of violence on survivors and implies that reporting it would be something akin to reporting home robbery or vandalism, really ignoring the fears that survivors face and how our system is really biased against survivors.
The hashtag why I didn't report suggests that Trump struck a nerve. What's at the heart of this outrage about his tweet?
I think what's at the heart of it is just survivors are so tired of the victim blaming. They're just really tired of the survivor being scrutinized and discredited and everyone assuming that the problem's with the survivor instead of focusing on the perpetrator. And if we look at the stories that are coming out from why I didn't report, you're seeing survivors saying, well, I didn't report because the person was my boss, or I didn't report because the person held power over me, or I did report and nobody believed me, or I faced reprisal.
Given these factors, how traumatic might it be for someone even of Ms. Blasey Ford's stature to come forward?
It's going to be traumatic. Sexual violence is deeply traumatizing. It affects sort of our inner core, our sense of normalcy and how we move through society. And the reality is that, for someone like Blasey Ford, it happened 30 years ago, which means that she probably dealt with it, healed, and got on with her life. And here she is now, 30 years later, having to reopen that wound and deal with the backlash and deal with the effects on her family.
How is the environment changing for sexual assault victims today, making it easier for people to tell their stories?
Well, I think Blasey Ford's a good example that some things are changing, because 30 years later, she's actually able to now tell her story. I think what's happening is that social media is creating a safe space for survivors to come forward, to be amongst other survivors, to see that their story is one of many, and to really realize that sexual violence, it has no geography, it has no ethnicity, it has no citizenship or even income level. It's endemic, it happens everywhere. And social media, because it's so universal and accessible, it's showing that it affects everybody around the world.
Is there anything particular about the situation in Canada?
I think that it is nothing actually particular in Canada, aside from the fact that we're gaining more knowledge. We obviously have more access to social media as a developed country, but I think Canada is like all countries in the world, where we're really just beginning to grapple about how endemic sexual violence is, and that we need to focus on perpetrators. We need to also rethink how our criminal justice system handles these cases, because we know it's 1 in 6 in Canada that are affected by sexual violence, and we know with those high numbers that we can't take the approach of not believing that survivors can be discredited. That sort of typical criminal justice approach that we usually use in our adversarial system of innocent until proven guilty. That doesn't work for the offense of sexual violence.
And Rini Geer says that while social media provide a place for survivors of sexual violence to share their stories and to know they're not alone, she says the posted comments show that this kind of aggression knows no boundaries, and is endemic in countries right around the world. And I should mention that interview was done before the hearings on the Kavanaugh nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court.
All right.
And certainly there's going to be a lot more conversation on this topic.
Oh, indeed. It's a huge, huge story in the United States and here in Canada, I guess around the world as well. You know. On a happier note, we have a surprise. And this comes from Marie-Claude.
Yes.
And oh my goodness gracious, look at this.
Wow, whiskey? Remember I said I would bring whiskey when I was telling you about my trip to Scotland?
Malt.
This came from Scotland?
This is
fabulous.
Originally.
Yeah. It's cheaper to buy it here.
It came from down the street, but originally it came from Scotland.
Oh my God.
12 years ago they
said. Mark, you're in charge of
nice
pouring
glasses. Did the glasses come from Scotland?
No, this is something else.
You just happen to have Jack Daniels glasses.
Well, this is not Jack Daniels. This is Beaumont.
This will help your cold.
Yeah, very good.
For medicinal purposes only.
You need to put a bit of water in it because it's from the Isle of Islay, and it's a very smoky. Peaty and smoky. So I think it's better with a bit of. Now, I also have food to go with that, but should we wait for next week for the food?
No.
All right.
What time is it? Do we have time? What time are we off the air?
Well, we have like 1 minute to go.
This is the most. This is a premiere in Facebook Lives. We're going to have with whiskey creton, which is a Québécois spread. Wow. So here we go.
How nice.
All right. Well,
maybe you should save it for next week.
Yeah, well,
so people can see us smacking our lips.
Okay, let's save it. I'll tell you all
more whiskey next week. Cheers.
Sure. Well,
cheers. Here's to your trip to Scotland.
Well, here's to our listeners and viewers.
And here's to our listeners. Yes.
We salute you.
I feel better already.
Isn't it good? Mm-hmm. I had whiskey every day when I was there.
It kind of tastes like the inside of my
I'm going to hold it up to the microphone so they can smell the odor here. Right. Beautiful. Well, what a way to end the show. My goodness, that is all the time we have for today.
Isn't it hard to drink in a square glass, though?
Yeah.
You have a piece of
We'll have to do more experimenting with round glasses.
food in your glass. Sorry about that. It's
We don't charge extra for that.
Chives.
That's chives. We don't charge extra.
It's grass.
Okay, you better tell people who we are.
Lynn Desjardins, Lavonne Savuns, Marie-Claude Simard, Chantal Saint-Sauveur, Pierre Dutil. I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next week. Bye-bye and cheers.
Cheers, and thank you.